All right, thanks. Yeah, land management. Next up, we're going to have Betsi Oliver with the Prince William Sound Recreation Advisory Committee to talk about more oil-related response topics. So please welcome Betsi.
All right, hi everyone. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. That's a mouthful. We've got two Regional Citizens Advisory Councils in the area, Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet. We're separate organizations. Prince William Sound RCAC works with the terminal of the pipeline and the tankers that come from there, versus Cook Inlet RCAC works with any oil that comes out of the Cook Inlet. So I'll explain our regions a little bit more. I'll probably use RCAC going forward because it's such a mouthful, but I'm referring to Prince William Sound RCAC. And we were formed after the Exxon Valdez oil spill to represent citizens and to have a voice in environmental security of the oil transport in our region. I've got Final Destination on this screen. That was unexpected. So just a little context. I've got two things I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start with kind of your primer on the Exxon Valdez oil spill, because I know we've got folks here who are newer to the region or are working as guides and who maybe we've heard a lot about some of the impacts of this spill, but let's get a little oriented to what happened. And then I'm also going to share some of the resources that RCAC has to support communities, including Whittier and the other communities of Prince William Sound, should there be another large spill like the Exxon Valdez. So a little context, we're talking about the pipeline that starts on the North Slope up there and works its way 810 miles down to Valdez. The marine terminal is in Valdez, where they have temporary storage of the crude oil, and from there it will get loaded onto tankers. This is a more recent tanker. It's about the same size, though, as the Exxon Valdez tanker. So this is a 941-foot tanker. The Exxon Valdez held 53 million gallons of oil. So each tanker, give or take, but that's about the average size that we're seeing. And from there, the tankers depart. So you can see Valdez Marine Terminal up there in the right-hand corner. The tankers depart. They follow this red line, more or less, out through the Sound, out through Hitchenbrook Entrance, the gap between Hitchenbrook and Montague Islands, and out into the Gulf of Alaska. From there, most of them head down to Washington and California to refineries down there. Occasionally, we have a ship that heads over to Asia. So what happened in the Exxon Valdez oil spill is that, so this is like zooming in on that map. Can you kind of see, I don't know if this, nope. So the tanker left from Valdez. It made it through the Narrows, that pinch point there that you can see. And this was just after midnight, March 24th, 1989. And what happened was, at that time, Columbia Glacier was much larger and kicking off a lot more ice, massive icebergs. Has anyone been out to Columbia Bay and seen the size of the icebergs out there? They're absolutely massive. Nowadays, the glaciers receded a whole bunch, so most of those icebergs get hung up on the terminal moraine, and they kind of have broken apart or melted before they get out into the Sound. But in '89, you were still having huge amounts of ice, and so it was not uncommon for a tanker, as it was leaving, to have to navigate around the ice. And there's actually lanes. It's sort of like a highway. There's no striped lines, of course, but there's lanes, an ingoing and outgoing lane that the tankers use. And so they called in to the Coast Guard and they said, can we get permission to kind of merge into the oncoming traffic lane in order to skirt around the ice? And they said, yep, go ahead. This was normal, not uncommon at that time. That's when things started to go unnormal. So you can see this black line. The tanker left its lane, but kept going. It didn't veer into the oncoming traffic lane, if you will, and then come back as it normally would. It just kept going, and it went past the oncoming lane and kept going towards Bly Island and Bly Reef out there. At some point, the captain went down to his bunk. He was not in the pilot house there, and the third mate was at the helm. And when they realized, by the time they realized where they were and what was, that they were in this reef area, they did try to turn the tanker, but it was too late. As you can imagine, a nearly 1,000-foot ship holding 53 million gallons of oil doesn't exactly turn on a dime. And so they grounded with Bly Reef. And you may hear about Captain Joe Hazelwood. He was the captain, and there's a lot of a discussion about the fact that he had multiple DUIs. He'd been seen drinking earlier that evening in a bar in Valdez. Was the captain drunk, and is that the problem? I can't say yes or no to that, but what I can say is that people who really have looked at this spill say that that's a little bit of a scapegoat. Whether or not that was the case, there was a lot more involved that resulted in this happening. The radar system on the ship was not operating properly. The Coast Guard was supposed to be watching them on their radar from Valdez, and they never, asked the ship, where are you going, right? So leading up to the accident, there were already a number of contributing factors. So the tanker hit the reef and started leaking oil. That's enough of a disaster, right? But actually what happened afterwards compounded the disaster, because they weren't prepared to respond in the way they were supposed to be, and they weren't prepared to respond adequately. So for the first 3 days after the spill, they had calm weather. It was flat, calm. Oh, here, there we go. That's the Exxon Valdez. You can see the sheen around it. We saw this picture earlier from Josie. So the village of Tititlik is kind of in the back of this. So it's very nearby the village of Tititlik. After 3 days, there was a winter storm that came through, and this blew the oil 30 miles from the source of origin, from the tanker. And at this point, there's no chance of containing it, and it's just a matter of chasing down the oil as it's, trying to keep it off the shore and trying to get it off the shores once it lands. Some of the factors that made this such a disaster, they had another ship that was designed to come and lighter the oil off, get any remaining oil off or clean the oil up out of the ocean, and it was in dry dock. It had a hole in it. It was up on land. The equipment that they had in Valdez, staged, supposedly ready to go, they hadn't cleared the connexes of snow. They were under about 12 feet of snow. The stories that I hear, it sounds like everyone was kind of on the phone going, this is your job. No, this is your job. What are we going to do? I don't know. So there's obviously a lot of nuance to this, and I'm simplifying it for you guys. But just to give a sense of, there were many, many, many layers of controls that were supposed to be in place that fell through to make this a much bigger disaster, even than just a tanker hitting a rock and spilling oil. So this darker blue shows the extent of where the oil spread to eventually. This is about 3 months after the spill. And this will also explain why. So RCAC, we're called Prince William Sound RCAC, but we represent all these member communities all the way down to Kodiak. That's the island of Kodiak there in the bottom, what is that, left? You just got to move my mouse, and that should keep that screen up and running. Yeah. I've got octopus arms today. I'm trying to run the tech and present at the same time. So this is about, depending on, how you calculate the numbers or who you ask, it was an estimated 11 million gallons of oil spilled, and it oiled an estimated 1,300 miles of coastline. So this shows, I think this is about 400 miles as the crow flies, but because the coastline is so convoluted, that would be like a spill from Seattle to Los Angeles. So some of you may recall having seen some of these images, or maybe you were, I was young when the spill happened and my parents had left Alaska, but they still were very connected to Alaska. I remember this incident because they got the television out of the closet and set it up in the living room so that we could watch this. They could watch this unfolding on TV. And people all over the country, and especially in Alaska or in this region, remember where they were when they heard about this spill. They remember how it impacted them. Some of the impacts included an estimated 250,000 seabirds were killed, 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, and 22 killer whales. So some of you were asking earlier, this was now 32 years ago, more or less, has Prince William Sound recovered? And that's a really difficult question to answer. It depends on what metrics we want to look at. For example, this is one of our contractors, and he's taking some samples off the blue mussels. So that's what's on those rocks. Anyone who's been out there at a lower tide knows our American blue mussel out there. And they're if you test the tissue of the mussel, you can actually tell if it's stressed by the presence of oil in its environment. It makes kind of like an immune response when it's trying to clear oil out of its system. So we can go out and we can test the mussels. We also test the water directly to see if there's hydrocarbons in the water. And as of this year, not new to this year, but as of right now, when you go and test the mussels or you test the water, we say, yes, it's clean. There's no evidence of oil from the Exxon Valdez oil spill in the mussels or in the water that we test. It's very clean. But it gets a little more complicated when you start looking at the species. So this is a chart from the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council. They've been mentioned a couple of times. They made this in about 2014 to say what species have recovered and which ones haven't. If we take a look at sediments, you'll see that's listed as recovering. So I've got some jars I'm going to pass around for those of you who are here in the room. Please don't open these, but you can take a look. One was collected in 2003. One was collected in 2013, but folks who are still going out there say it's still very similar now. I'll start passing these. So there are a few sites around Prince William Sound where if you dig down into the substrate, you can still find oil. And the thing about this oil is it's not even weathered. Like when you can tell how long oil has been exposed to oxygen and sunlight by its chemical composition. And when they test this oil, it only looks like it's 12 days old because it's been pushed down. And so it's really actually quite stable under there. And until somebody or something goes and digs it up, it may not actually be impacting the environment. The mussels nearby have shown that they don't have it in their tissues. So another way we can look is like at the killer whales. There's two different types of killer whales in the Sound. There's ones that eat salmon, and then there's the ones that eat marine mammals. And there's different pods within these two types of killer whales. And each pod is really like its own population. So one of the pods of transient orcas, so those are the killer whales that eat marine mammals, was seen swimming through the oil around the tanker shortly after the spill. And a number of the members of that pod were never seen again. And also that pod has never reproduced. They haven't had an offspring since that time. So even though there are still members of that pod who are still alive, they're essentially an extinct pod. But there are still killer whales in Prince William Sound, right? So it's complicated. Another one that I wanted to highlight for you is the herring. And I'm not going to actually share too much about this because I peeked ahead on the agenda and there's going to be a longer session later going into the herring because it's actually quite fascinating. What this graph shows is, so the peak up there at the top is right around 89, and herring come back 4 or 5 years later. So you can see that crash that happens would have been the herring that were eggs the year of the spill, right? So this looks like a smoking gun that the oil spill killed the herring population. And the herring fishery was a $12 million a year fishery in Prince William Sound, and there has been no commercial fishery for herring ever since. And there are still fishermen in Cordova who identify as herring fishermen, even though they haven't been able to do their trade for over 30 years. Where it starts to get more complicated is that as researchers have dived into this exact topic, they find that actually other factors, such as changes in the climate and the trends of freshwater in the Sound, were more likely the cause of this crash in the herring population. And that also explains why it hasn't recovered, even though when we test the water, there's not hydrocarbons from the spill there, right? So it gets complicated. Now, the reason I want to highlight some of this controversy is because of the social and economic impacts of a disaster like the Exxon Valdez oil spill. You have communities where people are devastated. I mean, I heard so many people just like moaning and sighing in the room when I was mentioning how many animals died, right? And the impacts, right? Like we feel this. And also you have people whose livelihoods has just collapsed out from under them. You had people, bankruptcy that sometimes took years to take effect. You had increases in depression and suicide and alcoholism in these communities. At the same time, you had influxes of money for people who were helping with the response and people who made quite a bit of money and were buying new boats and changing their use patterns. And so if you can imagine the tension this could cause in these small communities. On top of that, we found that we worked with some social scientists to study the impacts of the spill on these communities and found that a technological disaster, so something that has a human cause like an oil spill, has much more complicated impacts on a community than something like a natural disaster, which might also cause a lot of damage, as opposed to rallying together and supporting your neighbors and rebuilding, like, you know, after a hurricane or an earthquake. With a technological disaster, there's a lot more stress. You never quite know when it's over. It wasn't until 2008 that the settlement payments finally came out for those fishermen who'd sued for claims for punitive damage. And that original award was $5 billion that was going to be split among those claimants. And in the end, over the years, it was reduced down to $500 million. From $5 billion. And so the average award out to claimants, you know, that was 20 years after the spill, was about $15,000. So at RCAC, I said I would share a bit about the history of the spill, and then I would share some of the resources that we have at RCAC to support communities going forward. I just want to note that we do a lot of work around supporting the system between the industry and the government that regulates the industry to make sure that prevention is strong and robust. That's the number one thing, right? The studies show that once oil is spilled, even in the best case scenario, maybe only 10 to 15% can get cleaned up, right? So prevention is so important. And so we keep a lot of emphasis on prevention. We also do this ongoing testing of the environment, building that baseline data. So if a future event happens, we know what the impacts are. And we support oil spill response so that some of the problems that I mentioned that happened before don't happen again. And so we are involved in a lot of different pieces of this work. But one piece that I want to highlight for the second part of my talk is some of the community resources we have in place for those social and economic impacts that I was mentioning. So one is we have a guidebook called Coping with Technological Disasters, a user-friendly guidebook. And this is it's a 45-page manual, and then it has about 10 different appendices. And the intention of the manual is to introduce to communities, like, basically, oh my gosh, the disaster just happened. Here's some things to expect, and here's some resources and resiliency that you can build to support your community. Things that were learned from working with Cordova in particular after the spill around some of this social breakdown that I was talking about. So, and it talks on the individual level, for families, the community level, local businesses. That was a big thing in the spill, was suddenly you had an influx of spill workers, and the goods in the grocery stores would be just gone off the shelves, or all of your employees would suddenly have left to go work spill response because they get paid more out there, right? So there's little things that you don't necessarily think about as being part of the impacts to a community because of an oil spill, that this manual can help local governments and local community organizers, as well as individuals, start to think about. Another thing that it talks about is, what if you have an influx of volunteers from outside? Suddenly you have hundreds or thousands of people. Imagine what might happen to Whittier if there's a big spill out in the Sound and people just start driving through that tunnel showing up, I want to help, what can I do, right? For a small community to know how to manage this. I mentioned there's 10 appendices. Each one of these is like an individual tool you can pull out. One of them, for example, covers professional training opportunities that for your law enforcement, your educators, different folks in your communities. There's a bibliography of expert resources from, most of them are available on the web now. That wasn't there when we first built this in the early 90s, right? So we've updated this. It was updated in just last year, 2021, we finished that update. There's also outreach activities in there that you can pull out. So say you want to host a talking circle in the Indigenous tradition or something like that. Those are available in this manual as well. And the great thing about this is that, yes, it's here and it's ready for our community. It was built based on what happened in our community, but it's also applicable all over. It was used quite a bit after Deepwater Horizon. A number of the small communities there worked with different pieces of this manual to help support their communities. And it's being sent, and not just by us, right? Our CAC is like, our role is to sort of be the knowledge bearers of this, and other people share our resources out. So it went to Mauritius during that big oil spill a couple years ago. And Peru, they're having a big oil spill this year. And so it's shared in different ways like that. And I'll wrap up with one other resource we have for communities. And this is, so there's this thing called the Regional Stakeholder Committee. And this is a piece of oil spill response. And it's unique to Alaska. Let me back up just a moment. I'm trying to go quickly here, but I need to give you a little bit of context. So when there's an oil spill, and not from your, if your boat spills a little in the harbor, you got to clean that up, right? But we're talking a big spill or a spill from a tanker. What happens is there's a whole system that is headed up by a group called Unified Command. So you have the spiller, the responsible parties, a part of that. The federal government, usually in the water, would be through the Coast Guard, gets involved with that. The state gets involved with that. One of the complaints in the Exxon Valdez oil spill was that the local folks didn't really have a way to share their knowledge. Like the people who were out there, the fishermen and the local boaters and the local residents didn't have a way to share their needs or their knowledge with the Unified Command. So in Alaska now, we have this mechanism called the Regional Stakeholder Committee, where members of the communities that would be impacted, or the landowners, we saw those land ownership maps, can come together and directly communicate with Unified Command. But what we found is because this is unique to Alaska, and most of us who live in our communities aren't steeped in understanding oil spill response and the very complex culture and information there, we needed to have a toolkit in place so that if, hopefully never, but if the RSC ever needs to be stood up, this is available on our website as a go-to resource. It's like the 101 on how oil spill response here works, how the unified command structure works, as well as helpful things like a dictionary of acronyms. As you can imagine, there's a lot of acronyms or other terms, right? Maps and templates for taking notes. So when you're in these high-level briefings with, people in uniform talking about blah, 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 if you're representing your community, you're more empowered to be able to understand and also share what they need to understand from what you know. So just to close, I just want to note, the Exxon Valdez oil spill had huge impacts on the environment, on wildlife, on the economics of this region, and of the social fabric of our communities. And the only way to prevent something like this from happening in the future is prevention, to avoid spilling oil. But should a spill happen, we need to have a robust response system in place that's drilled and exercised and fully ready to be deployed if needed. And RCAC, in addition to the work we do supporting the prevention and response, we also have resources available to support communities directly in the case of a big spill in the future. And you can reach me at this email.
Thanks, Betsy. We got one question from online from Mark. Any testing of oil effect on halibut? Rockfish look okay, but how about halibut?
I am unaware of testing on halibut, but if Mark wants to email me, I can dig into that a little bit more.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Betsy?
Hi, Betsy. Thanks for that great presentation. Could you just do real quick the safeguards now that have been in place since that?
Yeah, some of the prevention safeguards. So Mike is the representative for Whittier to the RCAC. Thanks for being here. So some of the preventions that are in place, one is that there's now a pilot, so a local ship pilot who stays on the tanker and steers the tanker through Prince William Sound. The pilot used to get off the boat before Bly Island, and they now stay on all the way through. So that's like a local expert. Another example is all the tankers now are required to have 2 hulls. The Exxon Valdez basically had 1 layer of metal between the ocean and the oil, and now all tankers have 2. So that if there's an impact, maybe it won't all get all the way into the oil. Another prevention is tugboats, 2 tugboats escort every tanker, every laden tanker that has oil on it, so that should a tanker lose steering or lose power, those tugs are there in place to prevent it from having a collision with anything. Those are some high-level examples, yeah. I saw another hand.
All right, thanks, Betsy. We'll move on to our next session.
Okay.
So thanks.